Produce these patterns in this trout model using the theory I just described for how the individuals make these trade-offs. So, for example, one pattern is just that the effects of behavior can be much stronger than the effects of predation. So if we increase the predation risk, we see that this is the reduction in the fish population caused by predation risk. The red dots are the amount of population reduction due to predation, of fish actually being eaten, and the blue dots are the amount that the population reduced by behavior, just because the fish were spending less time feeding during the day or less time feeding overall to avoid the higher predation. So we can see that the effects of behavior are actually much higher than the effects of actual predation, and that's been widely observed in real systems. A second kind of classical observed pattern is that when you change the amount of food supply, you can change the amount of predation. So here we reduce the amount of food going to the left, and you can see, of course, the starvation, the number of fish that died of starvation went up, but also the number of fish that died of predation goes up as you reduce the food supply, because they're having to take more chances to get food because there's less food available. So they get killed by predators before they die of starvation. So we could reproduce those patterns and several others, and we thought that was really cool. That this was like one of the most exciting things that we've been able to do with our individual-based models. And so these are all the journals that it's been rejected from so far. You can see it, let's see, American Naturalist twice. Yeah, and it's currently pending, the rejection is pending at the So why did this paper get rejected so many times? We got a wide variety of comments, and most of them we just didn't understand. Some of the reasons were it's not important or interesting. Some people were certain that it had been done before, even though those citations that they gave were clearly not relevant. And then there's the always popular individual-based models are so complex you can force them to do anything. And we actually went back and built a much simpler model in NetLogo that only included the feeding processes. So we could say this model is quite simple. You can't really force it to do everything. But I think the underlying problems are, first, there's a lot of inexperience with this idea of a cross-level modeling, where you're modeling a population as dependent on the behavior of the individuals. There's also a lack of culture of theory testing in ecology, so we use this cycle of pattern-oriented analysis to actually compare and test theories for behavior. And ecologists don't test theories, they just write equations. And this whole idea of integrating levels of organization is something that theoretical ecologists talk about, but I think this project is one of the few that's actually trying to do something about it. And so I think there's kind of an underlying belief that you can't really do it. We know it's important, but we don't know how to do it, because you can't do it with classical models. Okay, so I'm finally going to start my conclusions here. So what I have been talking about is really individual-based ecology, and it's a way to integrate levels of ecological organization in ways that are useful for solving real problems. Understanding how individual characteristics and behavior affect populations and communities, and how the population characteristics affect the individuals. And also, I didn't really talk about it so much, but how the environment affects individuals and therefore populations and communities. And this is probably the most important thing that we as ecologists need to understand. So how do we do it? First, state a clear problem, or maybe a family of related problems. Identify a set of patterns that have been observed in a real system that seem to characterize its dynamics for the problem that we're interested in. Design an individual-based model that includes only the entities and mechanisms needed to solve the problem and let the patterns emerge. keep it simple and focused. And then use those patterns to develop and test theory for the key adaptive behaviors of the individuals. And then I didn't talk about model analysis and calibration, but we can use the same patterns or even more quantitative patterns to actually calibrate the model. So one important thing that you should have noticed about all this, when we're using patterns observed in the real system, that means we have to work on real problems in real systems, which is not something that theoretical ecologists have always done. We have to work in real systems, so we have these observed patterns for designing and testing models, and it also keeps us from ignoring complexities that are really important. In other words, when we work on real problems, we can't ignore reality. And that often forces us to address problems that are maybe a little harder, but much more interesting, and often very new. And we find ourselves in unexplored territory, which I like. So it raises this question, are we doing real ecology? Can we get published in high-class journals? So traditionally, theoretical ecology uses general models, and they mean general as in not applied to real systems, and often we find that means they're not really useful for real systems. Whereas in other sciences, I think we use the term theory as being general only when we've shown that it solves a variety of real problems. And I think we need to push ecology into this direction, that if we want to show that our theory is general, the first thing to do is show that it solves at least one real problem. So how can we do this? How can we push ecology in this direction? One thing is to refer to our models of individual behavior as theory, and maybe even as a cross-level theory, because it explains the interaction between individuals and populations. And we can test the theory with our pattern-oriented analysis approach, using patterns at both the individual and system levels. So just to illustrate what we've learned over the years, the first study that my colleague Brett and I published on the habitat behavior rules, we used the title Analysis of Habitat Selection Rules. The second paper, we were smarter, we called it Tests of Theory for Diel Variation. So that's the kind of thing we can do. We can make it sound like this is theory. And so far I've never gotten any resistance to that idea. We can also address topics that are currently important in theoretical ecology, such as this trait-mediated trophic effects, and interaction across ecological levels and scales. So we can also consider classical theory, especially for our behaviors. There's a wide variety of classical behavioral ecology that we should at least consider when we're building models of individual behavior. And my experience has been that often this classical theory doesn't make much sense when we put it in the realistic context in an individual-based model. Some examples of things we've learned about classical theory, some of the long-used assumptions about behavior, when you put them in even a semi-realistic context of an individual-based model, they just don't reproduce some of the most basic patterns. Certainly the assumption that individuals make decisions just to maximize their growth rate can't reproduce many important patterns. And we also applied this Charnoff's marginal value theory in our bird foraging model and found that it couldn't reproduce some of the basic patterns that we've observed. Another example conclusion is that prediction, or representing prediction in your model of trade-off behaviors, is essential to reproducing good trade-off behavior when the future is uncertain. In another experiment, there's this concept of food limitation that ecologists often refer to, and we found out that in our model there's no such thing, that even when food is extremely abundant, more food is still better. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is what does this all mean if you're a field scientist? And these are actually thoughts from my colleague Brett Harvey that I work with very closely. He's the person on the right here. First of all, the very basic point that if you're working in the field that field observations of key individual behaviors and processes like growth are almost always useful for individual-based modeling. It's not something that field people always collect, often they do, but it's always useful. Second is that designing and analyzing individual-based models can identify meaningful field research questions. So if you build a model, you almost always identify processes that you realize are important but nobody's ever observed in the field. And so then you have a new topic for your field research that is clearly important. Third is a key difference between traditional field experimental design in the field and individual-based modeling. In field experiments or lab experiments by ecologists often compares a very small number of very different treatments, like maybe a 2x2 design or something like that. Whereas in models, we often need a continuous relationship. So what Brett has found himself doing is less of the traditional contrast of a few treatments and instead trying to develop a broad relationship. So fourth one is that individual-based models focused on mechanisms and processes can push field ecologists towards more complete experiments, measuring more variables, more meaningful variables sometimes, and doing their experiments over longer times, over more different kinds of habitat and wider ranges of conditions. So again, less emphasis on tightly controlled experiments and more emphasis on trying to understand the broad range of what could happen. Fifth is that using an individual-based model at your study site can overcome the limitations of field data. The model itself becomes a data analysis tool. Typical limitations of field data can include you don't get opportunity for true replication. You might not get observations before and after some impact. Whatever perturbation or impact that you study might be too small to have a strong effect. But when your field data can support an individual-based model that reproduces key patterns, you can still use it to infer causes and make predictions from your field data. And then finally, the value of conflict. What happens when an individual-based model makes predictions that strongly contradict what you see in the field? And this happened to us. We looked at the effect of dirty water, high turbidity. There's very good laboratory data that says that when the water is cloudy or turbid, that the fish can't see the food, and so their ability to feed food is strongly reduced. And when we simulated that in the model, we got, here's the population with clear water, here's the population with even moderately dirty water, and it just goes extinct after a few years because the fish can't feed. The problem is that we have lots of streams in our area that are just that dirty, and they have fine trout populations. And so something's wrong with the model, and so Brett went to the laboratory and made an apparatus where he can study how fish feed when the water's turbid, and he learned that they switch to a totally different kind of feeding when the water's cloudy. So again, using the model pointed him towards a very interesting and productive research question. All right, finally, I want to thank Charbel very much for the opportunity to come here, and to all the other faculty and the students that helped us. I couldn't possibly list everybody, but I want to thank you very much for the chance to come here. And just mention that if you want to know more about anything I talked about, we have a website with all the citations, and I don't think I really said anything that's not in these two books.
Então a gente tem mais ou menos uns 10 minutos para o período.